So, I have a question for you today. What happened to Sunsoft? I mean, early in the 80s, they were pretty much absolutely everywhere doing some of the tightest gameplay on the system, right up there with Capcom and Konami, of which I have, well, let's say questions about the direction that they've gone at times. However, the fact remains with the big names on the NES like Blaster Master, Batman, Spy Hunter, and many more that caught the attention of gamers on the console, and the name Sunsoft quickly became synonymous with quality, and then suddenly one day they were just gone. Well, if you have some time, stick around as we go into the early days of this company, their rise, their fall, and quite possibly a resurgence of the company, though if it's the company we all knew those years ago, it's hard to say. Now, Sunsoft got its start a bit later than a lot of companies I dig into in this channel, only really going back to 1971 as Sun Electronics Corporation, also known as Sun Deshe. At this time, they really had no interest in video games at all. As a medium, it really hadn't come into its own, and they were simply just a manufacturer of electronics equipment. It wouldn't be till arcades had established themselves with big hits like Space Invaders and Super Breakout that Sun would start producing video games. The first of which was Block Challenger. This was, well, a block-breaking game that's effectively, well, Breakout, which is not an uncommon occurrence for companies to make clones of another IP, with Pong being another popular example of this. Now, for Sun Electronics, this wasn't a big venture at the time, more of an experimental foray into the field, as they only really allocated 3 people to the development of these earlier titles. Which, when you think about it, makes sense, assigning a small team to try a handful of titles to see if the return of a profit makes far more sense than allocating a large part of your staff. It's unknown, at least to me, how well this game did, but I can only imagine it did well enough for them to invest more into it, because by 1980, Sun Corporation would start developing more arcade games like Arabian, where you played an Arabian prince, up to save his princess through the high seas, into caves, and even flying on magic carpets. Iki, where you lead a revolt in medieval Japan, seeking to overthrow your lord. This would see a port over to the Famicom itself, oddly enough. Kind of ironic given Japan. They would also release a game called Kangaroo, which was basically a blend of Popeye and Donkey Kong. Not that this blend should surprise anyone, Donkey Kong was originally slated to be a Popeye game before they had issues getting the license for it. It was around this time that they started working on console games more than arcade games, and even moving some of their arcade games like the aforementioned Iki over to the Famicom and working into other new games like Stations of Tokaido. In this game, you play a character called Kentaro, a fireworks salesman, who would use his own fireworks as a weapon while he defends himself from the evil merchant Gonzomon, who wanted to steal his secrets of fireworks manufacturing. Hey, it makes as much sense as the premises of other video games around this time. I mean, I'm not gonna argue. If most of these games aren't really familiar to you, that's okay. A good number of these were kind of lesser known games that really weren't that popular, and I'd wager a good number of them never actually saw a US release. At least not till compilations hit the scene where emulation made it possible for people to find the ROMs and load them up on MAME or some other emulator. No, Sunsoft wouldn't really start to get well known in the United States until Spy Hunter hit the shelves in 1987. For those of you who somehow don't know about this game, this was a vehicular combat game that lifted heavily from the James Bond franchise, focusing on one of the coolest aspects of James Bond, the cars. You were given a G-6155 interceptor to drive and an assortment of special weapons that you could pick up, like smoke screens and oil slicks. In the arcade version, these could be activated using the steering yoke with dedicated buttons for each one. The game itself was basically just a high-score challenge with the game looping endlessly until the player fails. That didn't stop many of us from falling in love with this game, especially with this sick tune playing in the background. Then, in 1988, Sunsoft would release one of their most popular titles in Blaster Master. This was a really unique title that follows Jason as he dives down a hole chasing his frog Fred, only to find himself in almost another world with all sorts of mutants. Luckily for Jason, he found a tank. I mean, why wouldn't you? When he slipped in through, he ran into this tank called Sophia, of all things, so he embarks on an adventure to find his pet frog in his new, well, tank. This is a really cool game, with side-scrolling exploration in the tank that could honestly get its own abilities to hover, drive along walls, and other abilities that allowed you to explore the world more and more. The other part involved taking Jason himself into caves and dungeons, where the game would switch to an overhead view while you dove into these sections, and often had a boss fight. This game, in my mind, really put Sunsoft on the map for many a gamer, with the cool level design, multiple types of gameplay, and deep challenge that it presented. This wouldn't be the only hit they had either. They would start getting into licensed games as well. To that end, they'd start with games like Batman for the NES, which was loosely based off the movie starring Michael Keaton and Jack Nicholson. This was an excellent platformer with tons of gadgets for Batman to use through the 5 levels of the game. A closer version would eventually get released for the Genesis as well. On top of this, they had releases for games like Platoon and Vester's Quest. They were even slated to release a Terminator game based off the 1984 film. However, the issues with the owner of the license made this not really happen. You see, the game they were looking to make was completely in the future, and the movie that you may well know took place in the present day. This annoyed the licensor enough that they pulled the license on this one. This didn't ruin all of Sunsoft's work though, and they would eventually rework this game into Journey to Silithus. The development seemed to continue like normal, with a mix of licensed and original titles on Game Boy, Game Boy Color, NES, and Genesis, till things changed around 1995 when the company filed for bankruptcy and began restructuring. During this time, the director of development, David Seiler, would suddenly announce that he's leaving to work with Universal Interactive. Then, in February of 1995, the entire staff was called into a meeting where they were advised that the entire company was shutting down immediately, and a skeleton crew would be kept to transfer the assets over to Acclaim. There's another company that kind of went nowhere very fast. This confused many of the staff that had no idea what was going on until eventually it would come out that Sun Corporation had invested millions in a golf course investment. Yeah, you heard me right. A golf course took down Sunsoft as we know them and cost everyone at the company their jobs. Interestingly enough, the bankruptcy actually wasn't the end of Sunsoft. They would resurface again, dropping games like Galaxy Fight, Universal Warriors, and Waka Waka, both on the Neo Geo. In fact, they would produce games all the way up to 2000, with the release of Blaster, Master, Enemy Below, and Power Quest being the last ones released in the States. They would close up shop for a while, citing several factors such as next-generation console transition and high overhead costs. These and other factors would cause them to close up shop in both the United States and in Europe as they reorganized further in Japan. During this time, they'd focus on publishing role-playing games and pachinko games, along with Mahjong. It's around this time that they would start to work with companies and get into the mobile market as well. This is how the company would continue for a time until an announcement came out in 2006 that Sunsoft was going to partner with Nintendo on the Wii Virtual Console. This announcement was a bit of a double-edged sword, as I'm sure many people were excited that Sunsoft still existed at all, as most people outside of Japan would have seen nothing for them for nearly 6 years. However, it would take until 2010 for them to finally drop any games at all, starting with Blaster Master Overdrive. Now, this was a reimagining of the original Blaster Master game for the NES. Sadly for many fans, this game would only see a release on the WiiWare store. And like many other games, namely Castlevania Adventure Rebirth and Contra Rebirth, would live and die on the WiiWare store, having never seen a port past then. Outside of this, not much has come out of the company for some time, at least not anything outside of Japan, right up until 2024 when they made an announcement that Sunsoft is back. However, the announcement was, well, unusual for most of us who are fans of them outside of Japan. You see, the announcement mentions a re-release of some of their older games dating back to the days of the Famicom. specifically Wings of Medulla, Taquito, and Ripple Island. As of today, you can buy this collection on multiple platforms, and it's hard to say at this point what else is in store for Sunsoft as a company. Perhaps if this release does well, we'll see more things out of the company itself, though it's unlikely we'll see any re-releases of some of their more popular licensed games, as they would have to reapply for the license. It is, however, comforting to know that at least Blaster Master has new releases that have come out in the last few years in the Blaster Master Zero series by NT Creates, keeping at least one of their most notable franchises alive and well today. However, what do you guys think of Sunsoft? What are some of your favorite games from the company? What games or IPs would you like to see them bring back? Which IPs would you like to see them take on again? Let me know in the comments, and while you're there, please leave this video a like. You might also see more of my content up on the screen right now. If you have time and you're inclined, check some of them out. And if you like my content, give me a follow. That helps me out a ton. For now though, thank you once again for making it to the end of this video, and until we meet again, happy gaming.